Right, good morning everyone, and once again thank you to the organizer, Paul, and his team for the invitation to be here and to share some thoughts about illness, particularly illness in traveling teams. So I'm going to introduce this by saying just a few things about what we know about illness in athletes. And the first point is we know less than we know about injuries, mainly because it's only over the last, I would say, decade, maybe 15 years or so, that there's been an interest in studying not just injuries in athletes, but the health or the protection of the health of the athlete. And so overall, the number of researchers, publications, and so forth in the area of illness or protection of the health of the athlete is substantially less than injuries. Well, are injuries more important than illness? Probably not. We know from data that has been published, some of it was presented earlier in this conference, that illness can result in significantly more loss of days of competition or training, certainly in some sports. And I wanted to pay tribute to the group from Norway, from the Oslo Sports Trauma Research Center, who've done this work looking at illness burden. It's also important from a medical point of view, in that illness, acute illness, and even chronic illness, obviously, is associated with the risk of medical complications during an exercise session. And that's another big reason for us to have an interest in this. And probably for the coach, the athlete, illness can also negatively affect performance, which is what the reason is why athletes compete. We also know, as a third point, that the single most common system in the body affected by illness is the respiratory tract. And upper respiratory tract infections are consistently, across all the epidemiological studies, let's say over the last decade or so, is the most common illness. The risk factors for illness are not as well studied as for injuries, but we know that there are multiple risk factors. And the focus of this morning actually comes from a conclusion drawn by Ben Claassen and Hildeberg from the Oslo group in their 2016 editorial published in BJSM, where they indicated that a major risk factor for illness is in fact international travel. And international travel is important. And let me give you one example personally where I was involved in it. This is a newspaper clipping from last year in a competition which I will speak about, the Super Rugby competition, where 30% of the entire squad returning to South Africa after they've been in New Zealand and Australia competing, 30% of the entire squad, players and management, returned with an acute, severe, infective respiratory tract illness. And overnight, the team physician couriered the sample to me, and we have a very nice rapid microarray system in our unit, and we were able to, 6 hours later, diagnose that this was influenza B. So 30% of the players were knocked out. And as it turns out, this is the head coach, and the newspaper clippings were very vocal about the fact that on that Wednesday, Thursday, 30% of players were sick, and they were going to play the Blues. Now, the little anecdote to this is, up to then the Stormers lost all the games in Australia and New Zealand, which wasn't great for the local fans. And there was speculation that this would even be worse now that they're playing on the Saturday against the Blues. As it turns out, they kind of fielded the B and part of the C team of the Stormers, and they won against the Blues. So it's not all lost when you lose a few of your players. Maybe you should give the young ones a chance. I'm going to speak about 4 questions and try to give you the answers to these 4 questions. We're going to explore travel as a risk factor for illness. We're going to look at 2 parts to that, during flight and after arriving at the destination. We're going to explore whether this holds for different types of illness. We are going to give you some strategies on how to reduce the risk, and I'm going to present some data on whether these strategies are in fact effective. So first, let's look at question 1. Illness during flight. So most of you will be leaving tonight, tomorrow, those that have traveled, and if you're a doctor, you may actually be called to deal with an in-flight medical emergency, or so-called IME. So what are the risks? This is a nice review paper if you ever want to have a look at it. It's a very recent paper from JAMA. And really the risk of a medical emergency on a plane is about 1 in 604 flights. So if you are a very, very frequent traveler, then you're more likely to have experience of being on a flight where this is the case. What are the most common emergencies, the most likely things that happen? And this is just a list. The most of them are related to syncope or near syncope, but cardiovascular and respiratory acute emergencies constitute, up to 20% of these. The severity of these, well, this is a nice statistic. About 1 in 25 times when you have an in-flight medical emergency, it requires the diversion of the aircraft to a closer airport. So the severity of these emergencies is about 4% or so. So in terms of traveling with a team, so one of the things is to look at what are the risks during the flight with respect to the transmission of pathogens. So I'm going to explore this one, which is a paper that looked at microorganisms and surfaces, particularly during flight. And it's related to where you sit, and it's related to what you touch. So this is just a map of a typical aircraft, perhaps, and the lines here depict the different movements and chances of contact. And essentially here is the summary of this. So if you wanted to give advice to your players, which we'll come back to, the high-risk contact areas are obviously the armrests, because people will breathe into their hands and touch various things. They touch the armrest, the tray table. In the aisle seats over here, they touch the seat backs because they will move along the aircraft, and in the lavatory areas. The lowest risk contact area is obviously that seat, the window seat, which only has kind of local contact areas. So that's the first thing. What about other contributors to that risk? And this relates to what you do on the aircraft. So this is, again, a slide, and this shows the number of contacts, the length of the observation from 3.5 hours to 5 hours during a flight. And this is an aisle seat, a middle seat, and a window seat. So first observation is more movement, more risk, and you are more likely to move the longer the flight is taking place. That's obvious. But here's the thing that's perhaps important. Less people are inclined to get up and therefore move around and likely to touch those high-risk contact areas when you're in a window seat. That's obviously obvious in a way as well. But that's certainly 43% of people on average in a window seat get up during a flight versus 80% in an aisle seat. Which really tells you one thing, and that is that window seats are least likely to be those areas where you're exposed to pathogens. If you're on a flight and there's one of, say, 150 passengers who is sick, what are the chances that you'll get ill? Well, out of the 150, roughly 8 passengers, so you could argue that's just under 10% chance. But here's the thing, it's the how close you are to the person as well. So the risk is around 2 meters around you. So where you sit, what you do, and who's your closest colleague or friend or passenger is an issue. All right, what are we going to do is the second part, that's during the flight. What about after arrival? And of course, this is not only athletes. So what are the chances of developing an illness when you are traveling, just generally, not being an athlete? Well, this is also a really good summary. If you wanted to have a look at this review, also a very recent review from 18 months ago or so. And if you take an average tourist traveling for 8 to 21 days, the risk of becoming ill at their destination is very variable. It's between, say, 6 and even up to 87%. And one of the main factors is the destination. And for instance, in this particular review, when the destination is perhaps a developing nation, then your chances are greater overall, from 40 to 80%. And the most frequent reason is, in fact, a gastrointestinal problem, diarrhea. So that's just the general population. Is the risk for an athlete traveling as a team, and you as team physicians perhaps, is that any different? And what I'd like to share now is some data just summarizing data from our own experience, and I'll go into that a little bit, from the experience that we have from our colleagues in Norway, and then also the experience we have to some extent from large games, but particularly the Paralympic Games where I was involved with some of the research. So what is my own experience? Well, we studied a group of athletes that travel very regular. These are not track and field athletes, but they are rugby players in a unique competition around the world, which is called the Super Rugby tournament. Super Rugby tournament is around 16 weeks, so it lasts for 4 months. They play every week, and they travel east-west and west-east between South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. And we studied this group, and we looked at illness patterns, and we published this some time ago in 2012. But what was interesting is that because we were documenting incidences of injuries and illness in both away and the at-home period, it allowed us to examine the effects of travel by studying the incidence of illness in 3 periods that these players were exposed to. Before they left South Africa or before they left New Zealand, Australia, we call that the baseline. Then when they traveled across the ocean for greater than 5 hours time zone differences, and we could study the period that they were there, and we could study the return period. And I'm sure some of you, most of you perhaps, are familiar with these data, but this is just a slide that summarizes the overall main finding. Overall main finding really is the incidence of illness per 1,000 player days in the baseline period, the travel period. This is going either from there to there, that's the baseline, and then travel and back to the return phase. And then for the South African teams, it was obviously baseline, travel, and return. And you can see this peak in the incidence of illness during the times that they were in the away area, in other words, at the destination. Interesting was when they returned home, they had the same flight risk, but the incidence in the next few days was less. And we published this paper again also some time ago. And I'd like to come back to this in a moment. Well, you may say, well, in fact, that is the only real data that I'm aware of in athletes where we've looked at this relationship. But we have followed this up, and we've monitored these players in the same study, which is an ongoing study. We monitored this over many years, and this paper, and I'm asking you to please not to tweet it at this stage, it's in review at the moment. And I want to show you that for 4 years that we have at least examined these data subsequently, in every year, except perhaps in this 2014 year, the relationship between the away time period and the home time period is always 2 to 3 times higher. The previous study was in 1 year, so this is now reproduced in over a time period of 4 years. So it seems to hold for every year subsequent to the first year we studied this. I just want to also mention a landmark study from the Norwegian group looking at cross-country skiers, following them up for 9 years, over 7,000 person weeks, looking at a variety of variables that may affect the risk of respiratory and GI illness. And this is the odds ratio, the risk, if you like, 4 times, in relation to the symptoms of an infection after air travel. And again, this is the next day, 3 days later, and 7 days. And although over time the odds ratio decreases, it again emphasizes the following, that air travel and competition were major risk factors for respiratory tract and GI illness. These are just data, also please don't tweet perhaps, this is also unpublished data, where we've examined the relationship between illness rates in various parts of the world in the Paralympic Games of 2012, and what we noticed, and we are exploring other factors as well, but what we noticed is that if you travel significantly, that 2, 3 times, 3 to 6 times higher than in the host country. So being an athlete who travels to a country to participate, in other words, the risk is much higher for illness. This is respiratory illness, but it holds for GI and all illness as well. All right, so what I wanted to do is relate this to my talk the other day. These are new data. Again, please don't tweet this. This is data looking at illness risk and your morning, evening, or heterogeneous type. We spoke a little bit about this. This is a study that's done one of the PhD students at the University of Cape Town looking at our 2012 Super Rugby data, where we looked at polymorphisms for the per or period 3 clock gene. And again, the evening group, the heterogeneous group, and the morning group. And we looked at illness rates in three areas: no time zone change, west to east travel, and east to west travel. And I'm not going to discuss this in too much detail, except to say that if you look at the morning group, there was a lower illness risk, for instance, with east-west travel. Firstly, maybe one should also say that this also confirms that in the no time zone change, which are these three, there was a substantial higher risk of illness when you were traveling. For the heterogeneous group, it's for both west-east and east-west. And as I said, the morning group of people who seem to have been protective against illness in east-west travel. Just indicating an individual variation, and it could be related to your genetic makeup and to your inherent time clock. So, question 1, is travel a risk factor? Yes, during flight. It's where you sit and if you move and who you sit next to. During stay at the destination, yes, 2 to 3 times. We have some data from the Norwegian group, from our group, and there may be an individual risk related to whether you're a morning person or an evening person. What is this relationship for different types of illness, different organ systems? Well, firstly, this is the same slide. It just now looks at specifically infective illness, and we see exactly the same pattern. And then this slide looks at 2 different systems, your respiratory tract, and again, the same pattern, same peak for travel and return, and baseline being similar. And for gastrointestinal tract, perhaps to note here, the gastrointestinal tract, that peak is much higher than for instance, respiratory illness. So in terms of what types of illness, it holds for different organ systems, that travel is important, and infective illness in particular. What are the strategies to reduce the risk of illness? Maybe question 3. I've just summarized here some of the things, and I showed you some data, not all the data, about what you can do while you're flying. So you may as well take a picture of this and apply it when you leave on the plane tonight. So try to sleep, adequate hydration. There is some evidence, and you could use it if you want, to have some nasal protection from antibacterial or antibacterial agents like Bactroban nasal spray. You need to be careful what you eat. You can't choose this, but your fellow passengers play a big role. I would say the high-risk areas in terms of contact, and also where lots of people move around you, are the aisle seats. Moving less, actually. Sitting down, sticking where you are, and just stay there. Maybe in the window seat's probably best. Of course, we have to balance that with the risk of DVTs and so on. So move and stand up maybe, but stick to your seat. You can use, obviously, and this is a good one, disinfection, particularly handheld gels. Maybe even take some wipes and wipe your high-risk areas, the tray table and so on. That's possible. Air vents is a potential risk. And and probiotic ingestion, I'm not going to discuss that, but there's some evidence for protection. What are the strategies to reduce the risk of illness when you're traveling with a team? Again, I know this is a long list. It's probably not unfamiliar to most of you. There are, maybe I can indicate to you that we did publish a paper on load and illness risk, and within that we had an infographic in BJSM that actually has that. And then recently there's been a video produced, and I would urge you to go and have a look at that, just general things. But it's obviously being aware of high-risk periods, knowing the expected illness, the types, a variety of different things we discussed in the workshop yesterday on traveling, knowing the destination, we indicated that, medical screening of athletes, hand sanitizers, handshaking, probiotics, etc. Planning when you're traveling, that's important. And then one of the key areas probably is educating your athletes. And it's foods and it's symptoms, reporting them early, it's personal hygiene, we know these things. Maybe a more important question than this is whether there's any evidence. Are these measures effective? And there aren't that many studies. And again, I'm asking you not to tweet this. This is also in review at the moment. But because we had established in 2012 and we had these two publications, and the fact that we have followed this up over now a period of 9 years, we could study this pattern of illness in the traveling during the Super Rugby now over a long time period. And following up to 130,000 player days now, we could divide our periods into two distinct phases. Before these data really became known, there was a 3-year observation period. And after those data became known, we had a workshop with all the team physicians. And we discussed and agreed upon and then implemented these exact guidelines in a bit more detail, but we essentially applied these guidelines. And the team physicians applied these guidelines in a post-intervention period. And what I want to show you are these data, and again, this is under review at the moment, so please don't tweet it. So these are the first 3 years, and then we introduced an illness prevention strategy together with the team physicians with the implementation, and showed that over the next 4 years there was a reduction. So there was a big reduction, more than 50% of the lowest incidence in that first year, and a slight variation across the years. But essentially a consistent reduction in the incidence of illness following the prevention strategy. We also looked at another parameter, that's illness burden, and also showed a 36% reduction in the pre versus the post-intervention period. So my last slide is this, that these intervention strategies that we have discussed and that most of you know, encourage them to be implemented when you are traveling, because there are some data that there's up to a 50% or greater than 50% reduction in the implementation of these. And it's a reduction, and I haven't shown you this part, it's a reduction in the respiratory system incidence, GI instances, and in the illnesses affecting the skin, and a reduction in the infective illness subgroup, and also a reduction in illness burden. So the last question for this morning, are these strategies effective? Yes, we think so. There's at least some data, early data, or that you can reduce this by greater than 50%. Thank you very much for your attention.